Rough Tiger production.
And you, and you, and you, and you were there. Some of it wasn't very nice, but most of it was beautiful. I think it's 80, I think it's
Yeah,
84.
it's 84.
Welcome to Dream Idiots, everybody.
Hey.
My name is Morris, and the dulcet tones across me is Mr. Bryan Treat.
Howdy, folks.
Welcome to October, Bryan. It is going to get no warmer than 63 degrees up here next week.
Mm-hmm.
Low 40s at night, so it should be pretty nice. Each week, Bryan and I tell each other stories and bring you along for the ride. We take turns at going first. We take turns doing all kinds of stuff, and including doing Bryan normally handles the curse word of the week. We've got that if you've never heard the show. So I'll be handling curse word of the week chores here in a little bit. Bryan, where can the folks find us?
You can check us out at dreamidiots.com. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Dream Idiots. You can drop us a line, dreamidiotspodcast at Gmail. Send us a topic idea. Send us a curse word you want us to do. Drop in and say, hey, whatever you want is great. And please, as always, on whichever platform you're on, Spotify, Amazon, Apple Podcasts, any of them, Podchaser, we're on pretty much all of them as far as I know. If you can like and share, subscribe, shoot us 5 stars, and give us a review, that helps us climb the charts. We would appreciate it.
And we also do updates. Do you have any updates this week, Bryan? Because I've got one.
It seems like I did have an update, and I have age has crept in, and I don't recall. So
Okay.
No, I don't.
Well, this is a very minor update, and it's I don't want to say it's inconsequential, but Bryan, you probably don't recall that I used Kenyan as one of my schools in one of our college quizzes. Kenyan lords and ladies. Uh,
Vaguely.
Kenyan is a school in Ohio. I have a friend who attended there about the same time that we were in school. Kenyan recently changed their mascot name. They are no longer the lords and ladies. They are now the Kenyan Owls. And it has to do, I believe, with a nearby river that is named after owls. I'm not sure. I'll have to look more into it, but that came up the other day. I was poking around looking at some stuff, and Kenyan are now the Owls. The Kenyan Owls, no longer the lords and ladies.
Okay.
So for those of you who care about that sort of thing, there's the sort of thing you can care about.
Okay.
The Kenyan Owls.
Are they the horned owls, the fighting owls,
I think they're just the owls.
Just owls.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. No,
Yep.
That's fine. Boring, but fine.
Okay. Has your memory returned to you? Because if not, I'm going to go ahead and start with my story.
Go. Shoot.
All right.
I'm ready.
Bryan, this is not really a sequel to your suffragitsu story from last week, nor is it a prequel. It's more of a sidequel. This is stuff that was going on while your suffragitsu story was going on. You ever heard of a fellow by the name of Admiral Charles Penrose Fitzgerald?
No.
Okay. Well, he desired to increase the numbers of British military enlistees, and he felt that the latest generation of British men weren't doing enough for king and country, especially with the rumors of war blowing across the fields of Europe in early 1914. And we all know what's coming later in the summer of 1914, and none of it is good. Backed by Lord Kitchener, who, like Fitzgerald, probably spoke like this. Kitchener made his bones in the Boer War in the late 1890s. Okay, so these were tried and true British military dudes. Penrose formed the White Feather. Penrose, not Penrose Fitzgerald, formed the White Feather Brigade, aka the Order of the White Feather, along with suffragist Emma Pankhurst, who I believe you mentioned last week, anti-suffragist Mary Augusta Ward, and the playwright and novelist Baroness Amushka Orczy, and I'll just refer to her as the Baroness from here on out. Fitzgerald and Kirchner were, of course, military men. Ortsey was, or the Baroness, was militant in her political beliefs and a true believer in the aristocracy and British imperialism. So already they're a fun bunch. Pankhurst had founded the Women of England's Active Service League and petitioned the causes for women's right to vote. Her opposite number, Mary Augusta Ward, she was an anti-suffragist at the national level. As I understand it from what I've read about her, she really didn't fight for this idea of a national right for women to vote, but she did feel that women should be involved at the local level of politics, which is kind of proof of the idea that
but shouldn't be allowed to vote
at the national level, but at the local level, they should be involved.
Okay.
And what I'm about to talk about is a good example of how that happens. So this is a powerful set of individuals, all devoted to the Order of the White Feather. On August 13th, 1914, the order began its work by recruiting 30 young women in Folkestone, Kent. These young women from Admiral Fitzgerald's hometown were sent out into the public arena to distribute white feathers to any young men of conscription age who were not in uniform. You heard about this?
No.
It was an enlistment program using shame as its motivator, as the white feather was historically symbolized cowardice.
Right.
There was, of course, Bryan, nothing, absolutely nothing that could go wrong with this plan. Bryan, guess what happened? Much to our dismay, a number of things went wrong with this plan.
Huh.
To quote the Daily Mail, and I realize the Daily Mail is, a tabloid and so forth, but the generally female white feather distributors achieved much notoriety by frequently misjudging their targets. Conscientious objectors, for example, were tagged with white feathers. Pacifist Fenner Brockway had enough white feathers shoveled his way to, quote, make a fan. These men might be objecting on religious grounds, and some went on to serve anyway in non-combat roles. I don't know if William Coltman was ever handed a white feather, but this pacifist member of the Plymouth Brethren Church enlisted in January of 1915 and became the highest decorated other rank. These are folks who aren't taken in as officers, but might be enlisted. I think he ended up maybe as a lieutenant.
They're being tarred and feathered, or they're just being handed a feather?
They're just being handed a white feather.
Okay.
Just be handed a white feather. William Coltman ended up as the highest decorated other rank British soldier in the war, serving as a litter bearer and litter bearer only, taking men in and out of combat on stretchers. Coltman was awarded the highest honor in the British military, the Victoria Cross. He was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal twice and the Military Medal twice, and saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives as a conscientious objector who ended up serving as a litter bearer.
Howard.
So you might be handing one of these white feathers. Now, some men didn't enlist because of health reasons, or because they were too young, or because they might have been the only source of income for multiple families. So if you're married with a family and your married brother goes off to war, who has a family, and your sister's husbands go off to war, you've suddenly got three families to care for.
Right.
And you're the sole breadwinner for three families. Then there were state employees. These were folks who worked for the various governmental departments. Home Secretary Reginald McKenna had to have such workers issued king and country badges to wear on their lapels to fend off members of the White Feather Brigade. So you might be going about your business doing work for the Home Secretary, and some young lady comes up and hands you a white feather and calls you a coward for not enlisting. Then there were the men who had enlisted but not yet been called up for training or to station. A Lord Derby program tried to inoculate these future soldiers, sailors, and Marines. They were given a blue armband decorated with a red crown on it to signify their impending service. In other words, I'm not in uniform yet, but I will be soon. And this worked only occasionally. In a section I'm calling Oops, sometimes men who were actively serving in the military and were perhaps home on leave or had been discharged for the military were harassed. Here's some examples. One young man named James Lovegrove enlisted at the age of 16 after receiving a white feather. He had tried in the morning to enlist, but was turned away for being too young and too small. After meeting a member of the White Feather Brigade and feeling ashamed, he returned that afternoon and begged the same doctor for reassessment. This doctor, knowing full well what had happened, noticed that the lad had A, grown from 5 feet 6 inches to 6 feet tall, B, gained 49 pounds in weight to reach 169 pounds, and C, aged 2 years since his last visit some few hours prior. Young man, I don't know how you did it, but suddenly. Then there was a 15-year-old boy who somehow managed to enlist, where his first tastes of war included the retreat from Mons, the Battle of the Marne, and the First Battle of Ypres, the combined death toll of which was 60,000 British soldiers. He was discharged with a severe fever because, you caught horrible things like fevers and all
World War
kinds
One
of nasty
especially, right? Yeah.
diseases. He was sent home. At some point, he was accosted by a gaggle of these feather bearers, drowned in white feathers, and he was so ashamed by it that he immediately re-enlisted. Despite, by then he was 16, having been through 3 horrible battles of World War I and survived them. George Sampson was given a white feather while riding a tram he was attending a ceremony where he would receive the Victoria Cross at Buckingham Palace.
Mm-hmm. From the
presented to him by King George V.
Right.
For his valor in the face of the enemy at Gallipoli. One of the worst defeats and worst battles in World War I. One soldier in civilian clothing took great joy in receiving his white feather. He thanked the girl and then used the feather as a pipe cleaner. Didn't get many of these at the front, and then dropped the greasy, tobacco-stained, wadded-up feather back into her palm, much to her great embarrassment. Everyone else on the crowded train found her embarrassment quite amusing. Private Ernest Atkins returned from the Western Front. The Third Battle of Ypres, remember I already mentioned the first battle. There's lots of battles there. I think I'm saying Ypres. Specifically Passchendaele, when a young woman handed him a white feather and said, "Here's a feather for a brave soldier." Atkins wasn't wearing his uniform because it was being cleaned, to get the mud and blood and shit out of it. He reportedly slapped her in the face with his military paybook and said, "The boys at Passchendaele would like to see such a feather." And finally, there's the case of Reuben Farrow, verbally abused on a tram by a white feathered devotee who kept haranguing and haranguing and haranguing him. Farrow turned to the young woman, showed her the empty cuff where his left hand should have been, and she fled the tram in utter embarrassment, as well she should have. It's easy to blame these feather bearers who, in the words of writer and veteran Compton McKenzie, were, quote, idiotic young women using white feathers to get rid of boyfriends of whom they were tired. But surely the Fitzgeralds, the Kitcheners, the Wards, the Pankhursts, and the Ortseys deserve the greatest burden of this disgusting display. Perhaps Ortsey the worst of all, with notions of birthright superiority and aristocracy, which we still fight today, even here, in this time and in this place. White feathers indeed, stained red, dying to brown, with the blood of a younger generation. And that is a brief look at the White Feather movement, aka the Order of the White Feather from World War I, which was actually revived in World War II.
Wow. Okay.
There were some movies.
So it seems like they had no. I mean, so these women going out with these feathers, they have no admin. There's no clerical work being done. They're just, you're a man not in uniform between the ages nominally of 15 and 40, and you're here and you shouldn't be. So I'm going to accost you. Or was there any sort of sense of who this person actually was?
Oh no, it was randomly left to your own discretion.
Right. But yeah, just stupid. I mean, it seems like after one or two profound mistakes like this, you start, okay, we have to impose some rigor to this process. We can't just be accosting anybody. But I guess not.
Willy-nilly and behaving like assholes. There's some films made about this. There was one was called Four Feathers that came out. I don't want to say recently, but it was a more recent film than that. I believe there's one from the 30s as well. Both of these were based on a 1902 book, because this went back. This is an a very old tradition about giving someone a white feather as a symbol of cowardice.
Hmm.
And I believe with the original four feathers story, it had to do with the Boer War, the occupation in Africa.
Right.
I think.
Uh-huh.
I'm not entirely sure, but I had heard about this some time ago, and it makes appearances in a lot of fiction, from the historical fiction. Like I first discovered this in one of the Jacqueline Winspear, Miss Maisie Dobbs mysteries,
Hmm.
where there's a guy who gets a white feather in one of the stories during World War One. So sources for this were two. Wikipedia, as usual, for basic bio facts on the various players in the story, including William Coltman, the most decorated man of other rank in World War One. Jessica Brain's invaluable white feather movement from historicuk.com from January of 2002. Actually, that is January 2020. That is a misspelling on my part. That's January 2020. And John Simpkins' 1997 article, Order of the White Feather, at spartacus-educational.com, which was a really great read on some of these things that various white feather receivers went through in World War One.
Yeah, super. It'd been interesting. Super. I don't know. Regrettable.
Super infuriating. I mean,
yeah, infuriating and out of bounds. Like, maybe just make sure you know who you're talking to when you accost someone on the street.
I mean, I'm completely against slapping women, but in the case of the dude slapping her with the pay book, I'm not sure many people sprang to her defense on that train. So,
Well, yeah, no, I'm sure not. Yeah, screw you.
And now I have a curse word of the week.
It's time for the Dream Idiots curse word of the week.
Sweet.
Bryan, you ever heard the term whistle dick?
I have not. No.
I can't remember if I've used this word before as a curse word of the week, so I do apologize if it's a repeat. But when my grandmother couldn't think of someone's name, she referred to them as whistle dick.
Just a stand-in. Who's that?
Yes.
That whistle dick.
How's old whistle dick doing? When she meant, and could you be more specific about the whistle dick in question? You know, that fellow with the brother who was always over here doing that thing.
Right.
Old whistle dick. So anytime I can't think of someone's name,
whistle dick,
I'll throw that one out. And who's my wife? How's old whistle dick? Good Lord, honey, who are you talking about? You know, that person from work that you did that project with, that did that thing that was
that thing that one time from that thing, right?
That party that time with the guy. She's married to the guy who
right
did that
the guy
thing
in the shirt with the hair.
Yeah,
right.
I think his name starts with a consonant. Old whistle dick.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. Very cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, ready for mine?
I am.
Okay, so the my title for the story is A Belgian Astronomer in Texas, and I'll explain to you why I'm making sure people hear the title first as I dive into the story. So the source for this story is a little bit random. One day back in the spring, I was working and running some errands, and I was a little bit early to an appointment. And I was in the Government Hill neighborhood in San Antonio, right near the south edge of Fort Sam Houston, and I came across a historical marker. I'm not sure whether these are put up by local historical societies or the state, but there was, and I was basically just killing time. The sign was partially obscured from view by overgrown grass and trees, basically sandwiched between two pretty dilapidated homes. It sat essentially in a mostly vacant lot adjacent to this alleyway. As listeners of Dream Idiots, I'm sure have learned by now, you and I both come up with ideas for the podcast from a variety of sources. I never know when an idea is just going to fall from the sky and land in my lap. When I saw this sign, I laughed out loud to myself because it mentioned the transit of Venus, which we discussed many moons ago.
Oh, right. Yeah.
On Dream Idiots, and included the name of a man I had never heard of before, and he is our topic. His name is Jean-Charles Houzeau, Houzeau. When I saw his name for the first time, I had no idea that he was going to be as rich a topic as he was. But we're going to go back a bit here first. If you were living in Western Europe during the tail end of the 18th century and you were rich, life might be a little bit stressful for you. Poor people and commoners were pretty upset at the time. War and revolution was afoot. The haves had a lot more than the have-nots. We have corruption at all levels of government, and corruption and is just rife. Aristocrats certainly rule the roost, but they had begun to learn that it was perhaps smart to keep some of their aristocratic views to themselves. If you were, say, a commoner or a poor person in a city like Paris, bread kept going up in price severely as the size of the loaf kept shrinking. Affording meat or cheese was difficult to impossible. Most people had many children because half of them wouldn't survive to adulthood. Disease, poor hygiene, even worse, sanitation. But on the upside, it was a great time if you had a business building or maintaining guillotines. So I don't know how many active guillotines were in France at this time, but it's clear that business was brisk. King Louis XVI, he of the cravats and the huge collection of ridiculous poofy wigs, is sent to the gallows in 1797. Marie Antoinette, who offered up the expression, let them eat cake, had to learn the hard way that they'd prefer to have her head. So she too stepped up and accepted her fate. Even though the monarchy was at an end, 4 of the first 5 presidents of France, all of whom were snotty, obnoxious aristocrats, were guillotined as well. The 5th committed suicide in order to avoid the guillotine. What a gigantic wuss. What a gigantic wuss. So that's the backdrop of this period of time. Jean-Charles Houzeau is born 7th of October, 1820 in the town of Havre near Mons in what is now Belgium. Weirdly, I think you just mentioned the town of Mons in your story.
Yeah, the retreat from Mons.
Yeah. So he certainly came from aristocratic stock, and there's nothing that this kid wanted for. It seems that his family was kind of able to fly under the radar. They were sympathetic to the plight of the poor, and they must have taken at least some steps to mask their wealth at least a bit. But it was only with wealth that anyone at this time could afford a real education. Houzeau was a bright child from the start. These days, in 2023, the official languages of Belgium are Dutch, German, and French. It's clear he spoke French principally at home, but likely was conversant in all 3. He later would pick up English and Spanish as well. He had a wide array of interests in academics. Science and physics intrigued him, and he studied everything he could. He certainly had a special interest and aptitude for astronomy, as we will see, but he was at heart a leftist and sympathetic to the plight of the poor, as was his family. As a young adult, he travels to England briefly, and it's clear that his family want him to start out on a path of academic rigor and glory. They want him to be sort of an Edmund Halley or an Isaac Newton. At the age of 22, he started volunteering at the Brussels Observatory, but he has outspoken political views, which kind of made it impossible for him to stay. So he's forced out. He did stay and work in Europe well into his 30s, but then decides to take a different path. In short, his politics at the time were more important to him than his academic interests. So he decides to cast his lot with the Americans, and he boards a ship. He lands in New Orleans on the 28th of October, 1857. But by the spring of 1858, he is living in Texas. So we have to say a little bit here about his appearance. If I were to send you a photo of him and say, okay, here's a photo of Frederick Douglass or Isaac Newton or Rutherford B. Hayes, you would probably accept it on face value. All of the depictions of him are black and white drawings or paintings. As far as I know, there are no photos of him. And in these photos, he's just kind of simply man with beard. But apparently in person, he could be described as an olive-skinned white man, or perhaps a light-skinned black man, or perhaps even someone who today would be referred to as Latinx. He was able to rather nimbly become any race he wants. You may recall the fairly recent story of Rachel Dolezal, who was a woman who was white, but olive skinned, or maybe she tanned a whole bunch, had a job. She was president of the NAACP chapter in Spokane, Washington. She was definitely an ally for Black people and Black interests. She was accused of cultural appropriation or misappropriation, I guess. There even is one article I found on Vox.com about her where Houzeau is mentioned as sort of a comparable data point. I can't really speak to whether she did anything that wrong, but it's definitely clear she knew that she was a white woman, and she was definitely happily passing herself off. Whether or not that's that big of an infraction or not, I can't really speak to. You have to remember that at this time in human history, in the early part of the 19th century, middle part of the 19th century, people weren't moving about. The average person spent their entire life speaking one language, and most of them lived their entire existence within 50 miles or so of the place of their birth. So all people, if you encountered new people, you assumed that if they looked enough like you and they spoke your language, that they were probably part of your tribe. And this is the environment in which Houzeau travels around, and everyone just sort of seems to quickly accept him. It's very possible he was just Western European, but it's also possible there were other races in his background. I don't know that we know that, or that he knew that, but it was, after all, it was called the Belgian Congo for a long period of time. So maybe he had ancestors that traveled there. Who knows? It's I don't really know how much it matters. But it's clear everyone who meets him throughout our story assumes that he's the same race as they are, or chooses to just happily ignore the question. It's also clear, because he writes a whole bunch during his life, that he doesn't really want to talk about his race, and he just kind of lets people make any assumption that they want to about it. So Houzeau passes through New Orleans, but doesn't stay. Makes his way to Texas. He pretty much instantly falls in love with the place, and he's trading 300 days of rain and clouds for 300 days of sun and blast furnace heat, and he loves it. His olive complexion is becoming more olivey by the day. But this is spring of 1858. Racism, slavery, and the threat of war is coming. At this time, San Antonio is the largest city in the state, population of 8,200 people, and that includes 500 slaves. There is a lot of debate going on between Unionists and secessionists, and the fight is about to be is in the Texas government about whether or not to join the Confederacy. In 1861, they do just that. I had actually forgotten that the Confederacy was as small as it was, and that it didn't even include several states that seem very southy. Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky were all part of the North. The South was just South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas. So let's not forget that Texas is and was part of the South. Stupid racist. So going to diverge for 1 second here and talk about a man named Charles Anderson. Anderson is born in Ohio. If you look up any biography about him, one of the first things that comes up in all of them is that this guy is he's a white man, but he's fervently anti-slavery. Or that he's an advocate for Black rights, or that he's pro-union. Fairly impressive in my mind that a man in the white man of prominence in the early 19th century would be known first for being a Black ally. This is a guy with lots of accomplishments, as we'll see. Around the same time that Houzeau is landing in Texas, Anderson is basically joining him. Anderson is having some health issues. I wondered if he had TB, because it says he moved to Texas for the weather. They have very similar,
Lord, which nobody does.
Right. Well, unless for your health, you need heat.
Yeah.
I don't know. These two guys have very similar approaches and similar views politically, and they become friends. When Anderson first arrives, he acquires 40 acres in the San Antonio area, but the threat of war is coming, and he decides that, he's a Black ally. I think the only way he would have owned slaves is the fact that they came with the land he bought. Texas finally does decide to secede, and he decides he is going to leave Texas quickly, and he frees all of his slaves. He's given a deadline, and everyone who was a unionist is given the same deadline in Texas, that you have to sell your assets and be out of the state within 40 days. He starts to do this. He frees the slaves, tries to get his life together and moves south toward the Mexican border. Doesn't make it in time. He is arrested and brought back with his family to San Antonio, where he's actually not kept in a prison. It says in the notes he's kept at Salado Creek, unquote. It's basically an outdoor encampment on the east side of San Antonio. I grew up 200 yards from Salado Creek, approximately.
Yeah, it's got a golf course and a picnic area. It's really nice, actually.
So with Houzeau's help and the help of some others, they hatch a plot to secure Anderson's release, his sneaky escape, in a scheme sort of worthy of Scooby-Doo. Late one night,